That's set up? Okay. You guys ready for these? I'll switch them on. Okay. Well, 707, really good. You guys ready? Yeah. He said called him up. He's sitting at, he's right here to the left. Okay, I got him now. Yep. What are you thinking? Introduce the other city commissioners? I saw Connor, Lanier. We acknowledge Connor, Lanier, and Kelly. And I'll save him last, and then ask him to come up. Commissioner DeLon. Interim city. Kelly O'Connor. Here. Okay. Nudge me if I miss somebody. If we could get started, if you could find your seat, please. I want to thank everyone for attending tonight. This is our third meeting of the Task Force Police Policy and Procedure Review for the Task Force, our third public meeting. We've had several other meetings. My name's Eric Payne. I'm one of the co-chairs, and this is the other co-chair, Raynard Ross. You'll be hearing from him shortly. First of all, I'd like to introduce a few people. Commissioner O'Connor, I think I saw you come in. If you could stand. Yep. Commissioner Kelly. Commissioner Lanier, I think I saw you also. Hello. And Interim City Manager Eric DeLong is here. Renard, you're supposed to kick me if I miss somebody. And then finally, Commissioner Reppert, who's going to come up and say a few words.
So grateful for you sticking it out and seeing it to the end. And we got to see this work all the way to the end. So thank you for that. And thank you for coming. And I got to sit today for an hour with Mr. Davis, and that guy's brilliant. I could have listened to him talk for another hour. And so I'm so thankful for this team as well that's leading us through this process. So welcome to the West Side.
What now? Oh, and Asante, how could I forget him? Asante provided the food or arranged for all the food tonight. I don't see him in here, but Asante, nope. He's here somewhere, probably helping out. What I'd like to do now is introduce the other task force members, starting with Hugh Martin Robinson. If you would stand, please. Thank you. Let's see, make sure I get everybody. Sonia Ford, Sonia. Captain Collard, he's the other one. There you go. He's subbing in for Captain Maycroft, who is graduating from the FBI Academy this Friday, and then Captain Maycroft will be back. And of course, Raynard Ross. And how could I forget this guy, Chief Rinsky? I'm sorry, Chief's part of the. I'll probably hear about that tomorrow, but yeah, Chief Rinsky.
And then in January, we actually began to unpack some of the things. So from January up through May, he's going to update the outcomes from those conversations.
I think what was just identified for you, I spent close to 30 years in policing, 20 years in the city of Oakland. I left Oakland become chief in a community called East Palo Alto, was also in the Bay Area of California, before I went into the Obama administration to work on policing issues and to be the executive director of his task force on 21st century policing. And that long-winded description is not for kudos about me, but to show you the exposure of the Jack Lamberth made was there should be a coalition or a task force put together to look at the policies and practices of the department to see if it's contributing to the disparities that were identified. Now, that's a specific mandate. That, in one sense, provides guidance of where we need to go. In the other sense, it can be frustrating. And I want to share that because as you look to and talk to, eventually see the product that will come out of it, it's in that lens in which we're looking at it. So it's not a review of the department of how we can do better. I think that will be something that you will be engaged in. And or is impacting disparate outcomes for the police department. In order to do that, we've had to take a look at what are the key systems inside of any police department that impact disparate outcomes, right? And so a part of it is we went through the process of looking at it, and we identified a few of them. One we looked at would be community policing, which you're going to talk about tonight. How the department adopts community policing, what it's engaged in. One will be training. One will be on crime reduction, how a city fights crime, contributes to whether there's disparities, and obviously recruitment and hiring. I started with those two because we are just in the beginning parts of that process. The parts that we have looked at, and let me tell you when we say look at what that means. We started with staffing and deployment. Now that sounds weird, but we believe strongly that the way an organization staffs, and not so much the numbers, but how they staff, where officers are assigned, how they deployed, how you deploy officers impacts greatly if you have disparate outcomes. If I were just to translate that is, if you simply put a lot of officers in condensed areas, then you could, depending on what you have them doing and why you're deploying them, result in over-policing, which would come out with a very disparate outcomes if those areas in which you're deploying are predominantly one race or ethnicity in any direction. So it's key to take a look at deployment, and we spent time looking at that. Now the process we use is long and tedious in that the first part we had to do is assess how does the police department staff and deploy. The second part then is that we would take a look and see from our perspective from 21st century policing as working in the field for 30 years and working with thousands of agencies, is that practice consistent with the best practices of the industry or the field? So the first part, the department gives its input to the task force. We then give our feedback of whether or not we think this is consistent with best practices and recommendations. Then there's a part where you get to weigh in, and you've already weighed in on staffing and employment. And so all of that information then is now given to the task force that has the awesome task of going through it and trying to see now what recommendations, if any, they would make in order to address the issues that we talked about. So with staffing and employment, I would say we looked at staffing and employment. We've looked at internal affairs. We think the internal accountability system sets a culture or a tone in the organization, right? We also are taking a look at training, how you train. Is there anything in training that would contribute to unintentionally or intentionally suggest that there's stereotypes of biases that impact it? And we've also looked at a youth policy that the chief presented to the task force that has since been adopted and published. Now, when we said looked at, I think we had a good discussion today. We're not complete. So we're not in a position to provide you recommendations or outcomes because right now we've been through the process of hearing presentations and getting feedback and looking at paper, but the task force has not yet been able to finalize deliberations, or we want to need to finalize deliberations so that we can then come up with recommendations for those areas. And so the key part of the process to me is getting feedback from you. That does matter greatly. And if you look at the last community meeting, some of your feedback, or the summary of your feedback, is actually on the city's website, and it is used by the task force when deliberating. So I think so far the process has been productive in that the task force has been working very hard for you. They're meeting once a month. There's a lot of calls offline. There's a lot of email exchanges. There's a lot of work being done, but we're still not at the point that we're closing out. So I think there's still work to be done. We look forward to you contributing to that. And I would just say the challenges that you're facing, and my experience has been, is not unique to the challenges all over this country. All you have to do, quite frankly, is turn on the TV and you can see the challenges, whether it's Starbucks in Philly, a barbecue in Oakland, whether it's calls for service, whether it's the over-response, over-policing, disparities, the shooting of unarmed African Americans. There's a lot of challenges that are facing us right here, right now, and Grand Rapids is not immune to it, not excused from it, and has to deal with it. What is unique, and I'm going to keep saying this because it means a lot to me, is not that you're facing the challenge, but how you're facing it. The notion that you will put together police department employees and staff with community members and take a look at policies. We can debate what that looks like, but that process alone is very unique. And I've had the ability, I've been deployed to Ferguson, Baltimore, Chicago, worked in Oakland. I've been in pretty much every hotspot you could think of the last 3 to 5 years. I've seen both from a capacity in the Obama administration or as an expert or consultant or researcher, and this response is unique. So I applaud the city, I applaud you for this part of it. I wouldn't applaud you for the outcomes because we haven't gotten there yet, but from this part, you deserve a great kudos for the work that you're doing and for you showing up at meetings, the last 2 meetings and this meeting to contribute, but you should know that this is the kind of process that can make a difference. I will close by asking for your patience, though, that the challenges you're facing that occur overnight, I think anyone that thinks there's a silver bullet that will fix it overnight I think we're fooling ourselves. This will take not only a task force effort, this will take an entire community effort. It will take increased accountability and engagement, and it will be a process that is bigger than any one topic or one person or one task force. This is something that this is hopefully for you the beginning of establishing the kind of relationship of mutual accountability and trust that when there are challenges that they will be dealt with, that you can respond to them, and that you can basically learn from not just here, but from other places around the country. So I will say this, our initial review right now is that we're very positive about what we've seen. There's a lot of strengths in your police department. There's going to be a lot of challenges. We've seen some opportunities, numerous opportunities for improvement, and we'll kind of tease those out with the task force to get more substance to it. But I think you should be proud of the work that's being done thus far, and I applaud, like I say, everybody for being a part of that. With that, I'm going to shut up and turn it back over to the co-chairs so we can get to the real important part, which is you've been able to share your feedback. So thank you guys very much.
All right, thank you, Mr. Davis. So right now, Chief Rahinsky is going to provide us an overview of what the department currently does in the context of community policing and the community specialist. And after that, you'll see on the agenda the couple questions we're going to discuss. And I guess I want to take notes of that for our task force members, in particular for our conversation pieces. Let's focus on the questions on the agenda. I know we talked about some things in our other meeting, but the question on the agenda is specifically the questions that we want to pose to our community members tonight. But Chief Rahinsky, please come forward.
Good evening, and I'm going to be very brief because this is an opportunity for us to hear from you, and that's why you're here tonight, and your input is important to us. So I'll give you a very brief overview of, so community policing, what does it look like, what does it mean, is it a philosophy, or is it a mindset, or is it an organizational structure? So it's a couple things. First of all, it's partnerships, it's problem solving, it's organizational transformation and alignment. So what does that mean to you? It means that our expectation of everyone who wears this uniform, from myself to the newest hire, goes out every day with a mindset that they're public servants and they're looking for opportunities to engage and to continue the growth of relationships that we have and enjoy with the community. So you may have seen some videos, some of them have gone viral as of late. It could look like somebody playing basketball on a street. You may have seen the video of us getting smoked, racing some kids in the middle of the street, and that was spontaneous. It wasn't something that was staged. The actual recording was captured by someone else who was standing on a porch. So opportunities for officers to be seen as individuals and to build relationships. So there's an actual term that I finally have learned, the contact theory is the term. And basically, the more time you spend with somebody, whether it's someone in uniform or whether it's someone who doesn't look like you or someone whose orientation is different than yours, it's an opportunity to build a relationship. And that's what policing at the end of the day is about. It's not just about enforcing the law. We're not going to arrest our way to better relationships. We're not going to cite our way to better community support. That's going to come about the hard way, which is what we've been doing, which is time, energy, and effort, and collaborative initiatives such as this. So, again, I want to thank you for being here tonight. Your input is invaluable to us. The fact that you took the time to be here is significant, but you're really helping drive the direction of this police department. So, thank you.
Good evening. My name is Jim Koppel, and I'm facilitating this process. It's been a very dynamic process, and the task force is really committed to community input. The thing I like about the exercise that we're about to go through is you think in some of these experiences and the fact that you've got a police department as good as the Grand Rapids Police Department is, that in the community meetings we get new ideas, we get new thinking, and we get fresh ideas. And in the last community meeting, you generated a number of ideas that, again, have been put on the website. And those ideas are influencing. In our first meeting after that last community meeting, we looked very closely at what the community had to say about this process and what ideas that you had. And one of the key pieces that surfaced in that process was community policing. And what does it look like? How should it be seen in the community? How should it be understood? As the chief has said, and Ron also echoed it as well, that community policing should be embedded within the entire department. But it is about community and policing, not just community outreach to police outreach to the community. And so figuring out ways in which to do that is extremely important. What we're going to do tonight is at each table, there should be a facilitator. There are tables where there are just maybe 2 or 3 people that do not have a facilitator. You may want to combine for the discussion. We're going to take about 20 minutes, and we're going to basically deal with a simple question, is as what are community expectations and desired outcomes for community policing? What is it you want to see? What kind of model of community policing do you want to see? What are your expectations when you hear the phrase community policing? And how would you like to see it expressed? What are the outcomes? And so we want each of you at the table to have an opportunity to give input. You can pass if you have nothing to say or to offer, and the facilitator will take you around a couple of times. He may ask one of you to help record your responses. He has a sheet, or she has a sheet, to record responses, and we want to get as many of them as we can in the next 20 minutes. So I want to be sure, would the facilitators just raise your hand? Okay, do we have a table that doesn't have a facilitator? I think we got one over here, and if this table could combine, maybe come up and combine with another table over here. Or if you don't have a facilitator, feel free to self-facilitate. This is not complex. This is not rocket science. So deal with that first question. It's going to take about 20 minutes. And then we're going to have some tables report out on some of the ideas that you generated or that you have in this process. Okay? So facilitators, begin. take about another 2 or 3 minutes on this topic. Another 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll have a couple of tables report out. Thank you. Actually, we're going to take 6 more minutes. Okay, 2 minutes, really, this time. So wrap up, 2 minutes. Okay. If we could have your attention, we're going to ask three of the tables to quickly report out. Don't read your whole list, but give us a highlight of some of the ideas that were generated around expectations and outcomes related to community policing. And Mark,
of sorts, where there would be a office for the police to report to in the different wards, and where the residents could come, you know, to talk to them from around those areas and that kind of thing. Also, we talked about de-escalation and internal affairs, looking at comparatives, so meaning basically looking at situations where maybe someone under similar circumstances were treated more favorably, and trying to determine how to make sure that that kind of disparate outcome does not continue to occur.
okay, very good. Thank you. Hugh Martin, your table. If you could introduce yourself too, sir.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jay Ragland. Here at our table, we discuss things such as officers being present in sectors such as schools and churches, as well as more in the community. Being positively engaged, being as proactive as possible, a clear definition and communication of what the intentions are. Stemming from that, transparency, a big one, accountability and consistency in police responses. Also, what does this dialogue look like? What medium are these things taking place through? Essentially, the big thing is trust comes from building relationships. And I want to stress that. Trust comes from building relationships. One question that was posed, I'll just say it. Are our expectations misplaced based on actual resources and time on behalf of law enforcement? Mindsets and perceptions that are negative definitely needs to be changed. Doing positive things. One last thing, which was something I had never thought of, but this beautiful sister raised it. 911 dispatch needs to ask more pertinent questions in the cases of non-threatening calls.
Okay, very good. Over here, Janelle.
We had a lot of the same things that Marcus and Hugh Martin's table spoke about. More physically located in neighborhoods, which makes it easier for neighbors to come out and meet their community police officers or meet their officers. They can write reports at those locations. They can easily interact with the neighborhoods that they work in every day. More programs within the police department so that officers can be spread around more and get to know more people in their officers. We talked about the on-base program a little bit, but other events and programs that allow more officers to get more involved with the communities. Community policing is the actions of every officer engaging with the community, not just those identified as community policing specialists. Every officer that goes on every call should be a community officer and should get to know their communities that they patrol and police. One of the last, we talked about expectations, and the expectation is that the police department needs to put in extra effort with those neighborhoods who feel that there is, or who see more disparity within our responses to calls and calls for service or contacts with citizens. And that so much is complaint-based, we should be more proactive and get to know more of the community so that problems could be identified versus having it to be a neighbor complaining on a neighbor. If we were more community-oriented from the police department's aspect of things, more problems could be identified with more proactive activity.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Announcement before we go to the next question.
While you guys were discussing things, we just realized that a bit of an oversight, though. For the sake of really, your time, and we know that you wanted to add your voice, but that you also wanted to hear a more robust or transparent update about the work, and I think we really failed you in that regard. So we want to add a little time at the end of our agenda to bring Mr. Davis back to the podium to again share with you in a little more detail some of the things that have been on the table, some of the things we've discussed. But I do want to reiterate, by no means are any of those things sort of have a neat bow on them just yet. These are just things that are work in progress, but just so you have a little more familiarity when you leave here, the direction that this work is going and some of the things that have been on the table. So after this next question, if you just stick around for a little bit more time to get that, that will be appreciated. And other than that, again, thank you for coming out.
So the task force is really starting to dig deep on the issue of community policing. Your input and these responses will be really helpful as the police department has shared their vision and what they want to do related to community policing. The task force is looking at that from a policy and procedure perspective and see how we can get to those goals and those ends. And you'll be hearing more about the detailed outcomes of this over the next month or so. Our next topic that we're going to be exploring after community policing is recruitment and hiring. When we sent out the announcement for the town meeting, we provided you a link of a publication that the COPS office put together related to hiring and recruitment. And I hope some of you had a chance to read that. And it helps because I wrote it. And I'd like to know something I write gets read. But we want you, hopefully that will be a catalyst and a stimulus for your thinking on hiring. And so the question we have for you that we want each table to explore is, what are the characteristics of the ideal recruit in Grand Rapids? What kind of individual should we be recruiting into policing? And what are the characteristics? It could be maybe empathy. It could be athletic. We want as many ideas as you possibly can generate around what you think the ideal characteristics are of the policeman or the police person over the next in the 21st century. And so facilitators go through the same process. We want to get as many ideas as we possibly can. And by the way, facilitators, at the end of the day, at the end of the session tonight, we want to collect your worksheets. So be sure Josephine Powers in the back of the room gets those worksheets so that we can capture those in this process. So, no, not yet. We only did 3. Okay, so begin the question on hiring. Okay, the ideal recruit.
probably will not agree with higher bills.
Could take about another 5 minutes. Another 5 minutes. Another 2 minutes, please. Okay, if I could have your attention. We're going to start with the table, Josephine. We'll start with this table back here. As you report out, we're going to ask the tables to report out. If I could have your attention. Give us 3 or 4 examples. Don't necessarily have to read your whole list. If somebody's already identified a characteristic, you don't have to repeat it necessarily. If you've got a new idea or something new on your list, that would be helpful. But give us 3, 5 ideas related to the characteristics of the ideal police officer. We'll start with this table back here. If we could have everybody's attention. Go ahead. Introduce yourself, please.
My name is Sergio Cira Reyes. Our group discussed characteristics for new recruits is, somebody said not an alpha male, high emotional intelligence, and we need to do different personality assessments, people with leadership capabilities, but also that are connected to community, much like universities do extracurricular activities and other ways to measure how connected the person is to community. I think police departments should also be doing that so that once they're in as police officers, they're able to relate to community. They have a strong connection, networks in community. Also, diverse police officers, strong social skills, and strong engagement skills.
Okay, great. Dan Adams, if you could, your table be next.
Okay, I think our 3 biggest ones, the first one was experience with multiple cultures, and not just experience, but a demonstration to working with multiple cultures prior to being hired. Examples of this would be us increasing recruitment within, say, the Peace Corps or the military, who have demonstrated working with other cultures overseas. Another one along the lines of the diversity was a diverse workforce that also has a history of community service within our community, recruiting within, going along with the city's Grow Your Own program, and hiring not just people within Grand Rapids, but people within the Grand Rapids who have demonstrated through community service, volunteerism here in the city. And then we had a whole list of different characteristics, but what we really boiled it down to is hiring good people person.
Yeah, good person. Okay. The table in the back. I can't remember. Okay, they're here.
This table, we didn't really like this question, and because there is no ideal candidate, and it was, I think, a frank and real conversation about why would a person of color want to work for law enforcement in general, and this department in particular was discussed. At the end of the day, it was the feeling that we needed to change our culture first. We needed to make the culture attractive to recruit people generally, and to make it an attractive culture for people of color as well.
Okay. Good answers for not liking the question. Okay. Something, go ahead.
Well, we do want to add something. One ideal thing that once the culture and the structure, the system is changed, is the person actually living in the neighborhood, they're policing, doing the community policing. That's one characteristic or requirement that would be nice.
Okay, thank you. Sonia, your table?
So our conversation started out more so of the how than just the what, and we talked about the intentionality of starting with younger people and creating an interest early. And then when we moved on to characteristics, some of the things that stuck out that I heard at other tables, but I think it's important that we hear that it continues to be said over and over, was that they're local first, that they have a historical context of the communities that they are policing, that they have good communication skills, and that they have good character and are streetwise.
Okay, good. Janae, your table? Right here.
Okay. So we heard that there was definitely reiterated a lot of what others have said around interpersonal skills, very, very important, compassionate, tactful, that they have some social work skills potentially, also sort of like an ability to read and understand other people from a context of how behavior happens and what are the repercussions from that. Definitely also talked about having screeners. So the people who are doing those interviews really knowing how to really look for those particular characteristics or abilities, and that the individuals who are being hired don't have to have a college or have to be educated by a particular institution, that really, you know, not discriminating against people who may have tattoos or other things that are going on, if those people have the skill sets that we're talking about, and really trying to look at it from a little out of the box, maybe from a traditional approach of really rigid about how someone needs to look or their history.
Okay, good. John, your table?
You stole my social work one. So everybody else has a lot of the same things we had here at this group, but social work or social work background was one of them. Again, good communicator, good interpersonal skills. The comment was made on practice the golden rule. Look for people that practice the golden rule, or treat others as you would want to be treated yourself. Honesty, open to learning, and someone that is public service minded and kind-hearted. And then again, this transferred over from the last conversation to this conversation in regards to growing your own, starting early, and starting young.
Okay, good. Next table back here. Yeah, middle one right there.
My name's Divine. Just like that table over there, we did not agree with the question at all. We felt that being at the police department actually works for the people, that the real question that needs to be asked right now, dealing with recruitment, is what needs to change in GRPD policing to make it attractive to Grand Rapidians of color. Some of the answers that we had came up with was address racial bias in the department, enhance efforts to connect early with the youth, incentives for officers policing where they live, intentional partnerships with grassroots organizations, keeping community relations tight, confidence, the culture is shifting and they can be a part of that shift. And how do we create a culture where African Americans feel they can make a significant contribution, and where people of color in the community and recruits feel like they are employed by a great employer?
Okay, good. Great suggestions. Captain, over here, your table.
They're already heckling me. Some of the same themes were kind of heard throughout. Reflect the community that we serve. Talking about potentially recruiting officers from other agencies so that we're ensuring that they're seasoned or experienced. But that there's also a value to young officers. Somebody stated that they need to pass their psych evaluations so that we know that they're stable individuals. Open to correction, somebody the community supports, they're competent, willing to learn. Secure, insecure is confident in themselves, not necessarily fully mature yet, but are on their way there. Honesty, high quality values, some level of education, but not necessarily that being just strictly college experience. It could be in other forms. The ability to understand important issues, be disciplined, understanding people's mental health issues or people who are in crisis, and the ability to learn and be caring.
Good. Did I miss a table that is not reported out? Everybody had a chance to report out? Great ideas, great suggestions. We're going to take this information. We're going to put it together as part of the report for the July meeting of the task force. And we'll review that as we get into our discussion around recruitment and hiring and as it affects policy and procedure within the department and disparate policing. Your ideas are extremely important to this process, and we appreciate you taking the time. There are about 90 of you here tonight who engaged in this conversation to help inform our process, and it's greatly appreciated. I'm going to turn it over to Reynard. Okay.
Yeah, so thank you, folks. Again, one last exercise. Well, not really exercise, but point of information. I'm going to ask Ron Davis to, again, come to the podium and, again, just sort of share a little more robustly what we've done thus far, just to give you a good sense of that when you leave the room tonight. And before I do leave the podium at this point, I also want to put a plug for a community recruitment effort for the police department is undertaking something called Policing in the Speed of Trust. And we're going to be recruiting roughly 300 community members to pair them with police officers, go through a trust building exercise, and information to be on the department website on Monday. So again, just keep that in mind. Check the department website Monday. It'll be an exercise to compare 300 community folks with each of the police officers in the department for some trust building work. Just put that in the back of your mind and please spread the word on that as well.
So I won't take a lot of time, but let me start with the recruitment and hiring point. And let me say that the feedback I heard was outstanding. Jim mentioned, and I hope you get a chance to read the publication. This publication, when the President Obama put together the task force, even after that, we felt, the task force felt, the President felt, that we still didn't delve deep enough into the issue of recruitment and hiring. So we did a separate convening in which we had Jim facilitate. We brought in law enforcement leaders, HR leaders, community activists. You'll see some pictures on a civil rights activist to really talk about how do you diversify the organizations. And I want you to read it because you're going to see a lot of alignment on which you come up here in a short period of time, and we spent 8 hours debating and discussing that day. And the notion is, this is when we evaluate it from the experts' point of view, our subject matter experts, we're going to look at it not just from a recruitment point of view. In other words, it takes more than going to a few historical black colleges, going to a couple of churches. As you guys have nailed it, we're looking into the concept of what are you asking somebody to do? As an African-American male, what are you asking me to do? Who are you asking me to join? And what are you asking me to contribute? Am I going to a place where I can see people that look like me, that are actually not just in the organization, but succeeding and getting promoted? Does the organization treat people that look like me with dignity and respect, or are you asking me to do something which would be counter to my own culture and people? Now, if the woman mentioned it didn't like the question, and I love the response to that. So one of the questions would be, if you believe, and I'm going to put believe, that the department's not there, and it matters greatly if that's where we're at, then the question is, a lot of people, a lot of young people, a lot of millennials, especially men and women of color, may be attracted to a department that has made a commitment to change. Because now you're part of that crusade, you're part of that transformation, that reformation. You're being hired for a specific purpose to take a department to another level. That's different than just going into a department where you think you can't survive and all you're going to have to do for the next 10, 20 years is to fight and to sue and to not get what you want and to have to deal with the conflicts. I will also share with you, if you ever get a chance, and please forgive the shameless plug, but I'm going to do it anyway, is I recently did an op-ed for the Huffington Post that I would like you to take a look at. It's called My Truth as a Black Man, as a Black Cop. And that I would hope would also show, especially when you get minority officers, the conflict that can, if we allow it to occur, when a person of color is serving in uniform, and how to overcome that and how to reconcile that so that who you are and your identity does not change and become indoctrinated by this department. So that a black officer is not an officer who happens to be black, it's a black person who chose to be a cop, or a woman who chose to be a cop, which means you maintain your identity, and it's that identity and experience that brings value to the department, not so that the department can take you, change you, and turn you all blue. If that's the case, then diversity is useless. It means nothing, because everybody's going to act the same. And you can see that around the country where even officers of color will still engage in some of the same activities of communities of color. So there's no exemption. This is not about the race of the officer. It's about bringing diverse perspectives to the table. So please take a look at that report, because it's amazing how you've aligned with that and the things you're saying. Even the rejection of the question is a very good narrative, because it is kind of, we have to start with a question, but it's very good. Now, part of it is I'm going to be careful with this because the task force is still deliberating and working a lot of items, but in a sense of transparency, I would have shared with you some of our observations and some of the things that we're looking at and some of the areas where we already identify good or areas of need of improvement. I talked about, about the youth policy. That wasn't initially on the agenda, but the chief and the city used the task force process to be able to get feedback on that youth policy. and that youth policy has been adopted. I've seen some community feedback. I'm sure there are some that think it could be stronger, some think it may be too strong, but I will share this with you from our perspective, from an expert point of view. That policy is now, unfortunately, very unique in the field. It's not as common as you would want it to be, and so one of the things we do now is we share that with other departments that we're working with so they can at least start thinking through this idea of what happens when you engage a youth. When you handcuff them, when you don't, the kind of parental notification that's not required by law, but it'll be required by community policing. That as a parent, and I'm a parent of 3 and a grandparent, I would want to know if you put handcuffs or detain my child. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And there's no other way around that other than to have a process that respects that. It doesn't change your decision. It still may be the right thing, and I'll deal with that as the parent, but I should have the right to know that. So that's one of the outcomes. With the staffing and deployment, I think I shared with you, we did see that the staffing deployment idea is consistent. And so you know the staffing is usually to make sure one thing, that no matter where an officer is assigned, he or she has the same workload. So that a cop in this area is taking so many calls a day, and a cop in this area should take so many calls. Otherwise, you could have one cop that's overworked and the other one is doing nothing. And so because of that, depend on demands. And this is where some of the disparities that you're going to deal with have nothing to do with police and everything to do with the other social injustices that we're facing as communities. And if you have disparities within economics, within jobs, within a lot of other areas, then what can come out of that is higher crime rates. If you get more calls, then they got more police there, correct? And right now, Grand Rapids is deploying in that model, which is consistent. And I don't think you want to take cops out of there because now you're taking service. But as crime occurs, and things happen, you start adding now specialized units and others, then now you have concentrations of areas that are small, that have high concentrations of communities of color, that now the department is exposed to over-policing those areas. So the key to, when we get to this part now with community policing, is we haven't answered the second part of the equation. We know the structure does expose the department to disparate outcomes. Just by the nature of how they're deployed, what setting cops out there, my guess is you can drive in certain parts of the city and see more cops doing activity there than any other part of the city. And depending on the activity, you can see the outcome. So if it's 10 cops in 1 square mile area and each cop writes 10 tickets, and there's one cop in another 1 square mile area and he or she writes 10 tickets, then if you live in that area where all the cops are at, you got a 10-time greater chance of getting stopped, cited, towed, and also depending on the violations, you're getting into taxes. Really, some people call it poor tax. People that are trying to survive now have to deal with things like bald tires, expended registration, cracked windshields, versus working together to try to fix it to make them safe. So there's the debt exposure. I'm not saying it occurs yet because we have to answer the second part of the equation, which is what do you have these officers doing while they're there, right? And that's what the task force has to deliberate with, and I think that's important. With internal affairs, we saw a process that does not necessarily discourage, but we did see one that is extremely underutilized. And I would beg that some of the recommendations that the task force is going to look at and what they're focusing on is, one, we want to make sure that there's no obstacles in the way. And I give credit to the department, there's not. In some cities, you have to sign an affidavit. You have to personally come to the police department. And right on the form is a big threat that says that if you lie, that you're going to go to jail, which makes people think that if they're not proven true, that they'll be considered to be lying and they're going to go to jail. So you don't have that. You have acceptance of anonymous complaints. But there are some clarity that was needed, and the department's already starting to adjust that with the task force and our policy. Clarity to make sure that you know that anyone can accept a complaint. You don't have to just go to one place. Clarity to make sure that you know that the department wants to hear your complaint. A complaint is not just a form of grievance about misconduct. It is community feedback to the department. It is a way, as a former chief, that I get to know how the officers are doing. Because here's the challenge I'm going to throw to you and want you to take back to your residents and to your neighbors. In some cases, it's hard to prove a complaint. If I stop you at 2 o'clock in the morning, absence of body camera, and I called you a name that your mother didn't give you, is my word against yours. And so even if that case is not sustained, it causes frustration and anger. But I want to know as a chief that what if I got 3 of those? Then the question becomes, how can 3 separate people at 3 separate times say the same thing that came out of your mouth? Which means now we have a bigger problem. And I can now respond to trends. I can respond to seeing at the end of the year how many complaints are there, how satisfied is the community, what are the number 1 things we should do from training. So training is not just based on the newest thing, it's based on the feedback from you. And the complaint process is one way to do that. and utilizing the civilian appeal process that exists is very underutilized. So you heard him talk about that. And with training, I would tell you this. Part of the work that Jim and I did when I was in the Obama administration is to work with state directors of trainings. And so Michigan has a state director of training, and there's also an association where all of the 56 states and territories, Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, come together to talk about training. And it's these bodies, these governing bodies, that determine all the training for all the police departments in most state. In addition to getting a presentation for the training from Grand Rapids, we also talked to the training director for the state of Michigan, and we talked to the executive director and the board for the national organization, the International Organization of Training Directors. And you should take very much pride in this, is that they have determined and told us straight up that they believe not only is Grand Rapids training the best in Michigan, it's among the best in the nation. And so that's a good thing, which means you have the capacity to provide the training. Now, what does that mean for you? And this is where we're going next, and we're still having a lot of discussion and debate. The policies, which is paper, are nothing but paper if not backed up by the practices. True? Policy-wise, you know that your department, and this is also a kudos, just went through an accreditation process. Now, there's only a handful of departments in the nation out of 18,000 that even try, and most of them fail. So the fact that it's accredited is a good thing. That will go to how you sustain the kind of change that you're pushing for. But without the culture and the accountability, that's a bunch of fancy pieces of paper. The practices is where we're looking at how does it translate to you in the field? How does that interaction? You can have good policies, you can have accreditation, you get the best training in the world, but if you're over-policed and you're disrespected, then none of that matters, does it? So as we look at it, we're not going to look at a blind eye. We will give credit where it's done, and you have a department that is leading the way in many ways. I think the areas we're about to get into and the feedback you got today are going to be now some of the, I think, and the task force recognizes it's going to be some of the more increased work, because now we're getting into the part that extends beyond paper and what's offered to us as far as practice and gets to the actual engagement. How do people interact with you? And that's where I think we will get the input. That's where the stuff you brought tonight is important, and making sure you hire people that reflect not just the diversity of the community, but the values of the community, so that you're getting people that want to be here and not people that are just looking for a job. And so I wanted to give you an update that there's been a lot of robust discussion. The task force is, and they're going to get mad at me and I'll probably get beat up afterwards, is frustrated that we're going too slow and that we're not closing these things out soon enough, because they want to give you the product and the information necessary. We agree with them, so we're going to even try to expedite it by looking at different processes to get even more input, to give them more time to deliberate, to get to the issues that go to the heart and soul of why the commission put them together to the first place, which is to identify those disparities. And I would offer, when this process is done, if you walk away from it at that time, then this process won't mean a thing, and I mean nothing. This will let you know if there are policies and practices. This is not going to be the guideship of community policing. This area you talked about tonight has to go beyond this task force and has to go to your neighborhood watch programs, your interaction with the officers at the beat level. There's a bunch of other venues that we hope we can educate you on so that you can start shaping what you want for the department. But I wanted to just give you that update so that you know that the task force, we are looking at issues. We are trying to be, our job from your consultants is to share with them what we think are the best practices. And when we get to the crime reduction, is huge as well. And so the idea of looking at crime through a public health lens. And so now we'll be looking at how the department fight crime. Is it based on enforcement? Is it based on intelligence? Do you know who's committing the crime, so that instead of stopping 10 people looking to catch one, that you stop one person who's responsible? And then when you find that person, what kind of services do you have to intervene to prevent that person from continuing to cause harm to the community and give them a viable chance to still be a part of the very community? So this is, I know since December, I think there's been, the meetings, your input has been significant. We've debated and spent significant time on staffing and employment, and I've been pushing for that because that's the greatest exposure. Now connecting with this piece on how you fight crime, you can see where if those two are not aligned with what you're talking about tonight, then even before you get to bias, even before you get to race, even before you get to even issues of misconduct, statistically you are guaranteed, without a doubt, disparate outcomes just by the way you're structured. So we know there's some things that can do to tweak it, and we also got to deal with the issue of the bias and the things you're talking about. And I would say that we would want to give you a little bit more feedback in the future so you have an idea what's going on, and that we don't see this as being a process going much, much longer. But we do have to close these sections out, so we'll go back, and now we got all this information, and the task force will take a look at it, take a look at our recommendations, and turn those into some recommendations that you can then share with the community. But some recommendations have been made. We talked to the police department about internal affairs, not having a, what do you call it, a conflict of interest policy. We're making sure officers don't investigate complaints involving their friends, making sure it's clear that what kind of process where complaints can be accepted, and they're already working on that policy. We've seen the youth policy, and with the staffing and the deployments, making sure that you guys are embracing the evidence-based crime strategies that are about looking at crime through a public health lens and building up community efficacy and not causing the collateral damage of mass incarceration around that. And I'm gonna close with this, is one part of that will also include, when you look at community policing and crime reduction, and I think someone said this tonight, it will also include community response. And that's right now it's coming to light, but not for you, but for the nation, the idea of the Starbucks, the barbecue in Oakland, the idea that how does the department respond to the very communities that they're serving? And even though a community may be high crime, that may justify a heightened sense of awareness, but does that justify a heightened response to where now, you know, a simple incident has 25 cops there looking like they're about to take on a mini war? Or do you have the kind of problem solving so that people, no matter where they live in any community, are treated equally, that the response is with regards to proportionate to the actual violation that they're talking about? And someone mentioned about making sure that dispatch also understands to take a little bit more time to do that. So that part will also come in when we look at community policing of how they respond to you in the crime. And with community policing, like I said, I can't comment on that yet because we just started, but I just wanted to give you some update to make sure you knew that we are looking at it, and I think we're trying to be as independent and objective as possible. And right now, the things I said is not necessarily 100% consensus, but this is the things that are on the table. So please don't take that to be final, that I'm not speaking now that the task force has stamped everything I just said. These are the discussions, these are the debates, and these are the areas that we need to complete, and they're working very hard on it. So with that, Bernard, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you.
What was the name of the title you wrote that story about again?
Thank you, sir. That was kidding.
Well, we got My Truth as a Black Man and as a Black Cop. Is that accurate? Huffington Post. Yeah, thank you. No, thank you for that robust summary. Respecting everyone's time, we won't belabor this any further. Thank you for coming out tonight. I'm going to bring Commissioner Repart to close us out. And please stay tuned on the webpage for the next community meeting. That date has not been set. It'll be end of July, probably a Wednesday as well. And again, check the department website if you're interested in that policing and disputed trust. That information will be up on Monday. As well as, excuse me? Are you taking any questions or feedback now? Well, I'll take them after we close. I mean, I think we had asked people to come out until 8:30, and we're about at 8:40. I don't know if people necessarily want to. That's fair. Yeah, so.
Well, I do want to just say again, thanks for giving up a Wednesday night for this conversation, and I hope that you met a couple new people at your table. I met 2 new people at my table, and that's a part of this work. That's a part of increasing trust and building community. And these engagement strategies, as all of these things that you mentioned, they all take resources. That to improve police-community relations is a resource-heavy conversation. And so, again, I just want to encourage you to stay engaged when we get those meetings up for that discussion on the commission around how we're going to allocate these dollars. We really want to hear from you. So please stay engaged. In addition to this tonight, send us your thoughts and feedback. Watch that discussion or show up at those meetings. Lastly, I just want to say, really what we're talking about is a culture shift. And we want to shift the culture of the GRPD. They've demonstrated a willingness to do that. I want to say a special thanks to Chief Rahinsky for his leadership in openness to that culture shift, and that's gonna take time. But I see that openness from you, and I appreciate that. And finally, I just want to make sure that I say thanks to Anita as well and to Asante for all of their work pulling these things off. Thank you for giving up your Wednesday night. Really appreciate it.